Picture this. You're sitting in a crowded military bar, watching a cocky Marine sergeant boast about his latest conquests to anyone who'll listen. He spots a quiet woman in civilian clothes at the corner table, assumes she's just another easy target, and decides to make his move. What he doesn't know is that this unassuming woman holds the kind of security clearance that could make entire governments nervous. This isn't just another story about military life or workplace romance. This is about the moment when someone's arrogance collides headfirst with reality so hard it reshapes everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and what it really means to serve your country. Sarah Chun had spent 15 years perfecting the art of being invisible. In her line of work, blending into the background wasn't just useful, it was survival. But sometimes, even the most carefully constructed cover gets blown by the most unexpected circumstances. What started as an ordinary Tuesday night at Murphy's Pub would become the catalyst for a series of events that would test everything Sarah had learned about leadership, loyalty, and the delicate balance between personal feelings and national security. Because when your job involves secrets that could topple governments, even the smallest mistake can have consequences that ripple across continents. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez thought he had the world figured out. 3 tours overseas, a chest full of commendations, and a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. He was used to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. That confidence had served him well in combat zones and military hierarchies. But confidence can quickly turn into arrogance, and arrogance has a way of making people blind to what's really happening around them. Marcus was about to learn that lesson in the most humbling way possible. This is the story of what happens when 2 worlds collide: the overt world of military tradition and the shadow world of classified operations. It's about the moment when someone realizes that the quiet person in the corner might just be the most powerful person they've ever met. And it's about how sometimes the people who protect us the most are the ones we never see coming. Sarah Chun had perfected the art of being unremarkable. At 38, she possessed the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. Pleasant but not striking, professional but not intimidating. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she favored muted colors that helped her blend into any crowd. Tonight was no different as she sat in the corner booth of Murphy's Pub, nursing a club soda and reviewing what appeared to be quarterly sales reports on her tablet. To anyone watching, she looked like just another mid-level office worker grabbing a quiet drink after a long day. The reality was far more complex. Sarah was the director of special operations analysis for a department that officially didn't exist. Her quarterly reports contained intelligence briefings on 3 separate international incidents that could destabilize entire regions if handled incorrectly. The tablet in her hands had security protocols that would make Fort Knox jealous. Murphy's Pub had become her regular spot precisely because it was so ordinary. Located 2 miles from the Pentagon, it attracted a mix of military personnel, defense contractors, and federal employees. The constant chatter provided perfect cover for her phone calls, and the dim lighting made it nearly impossible for anyone to read over her shoulder. More importantly, the crowd was predictable. Sarah had been coming here for 6 months, and she could identify the regulars, their habits, and their typical behavior patterns. Predictability meant security in her line of work. She had just finished encrypting her summary of a situation developing in Eastern Europe when she became aware of someone approaching her table. Sarah's training kicked in automatically: peripheral vision assessment, threat evaluation, exit route confirmation. All of this happened in the space of a heartbeat, while outwardly, she continued to appear focused on her screen. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had noticed the woman the moment he walked into Murphy's with his usual crew. She was sitting alone, which immediately caught his attention in a room full of groups. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to read people, a skill that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. This woman, however, was sending mixed signals that intrigued him. She was clearly professional. Her clothes were expensive but conservative, and she handled her tablet with the confident efficiency of someone comfortable with technology. But there was something else, something in the way she held herself that suggested she was more aware of her surroundings than she wanted to appear. Most people hunched over their devices, lost in their digital worlds. She maintained perfect posture, and her eyes moved just a little too regularly for someone truly absorbed in their work. Marcus was used to getting attention. At 6'2" with broad shoulders and the kind of precise haircut that screamed military, he had a presence that filled a room. His dress blue uniform, worn to a promotion ceremony earlier that day, only added to his commanding appearance. The ribbons on his chest told a story of courage and competence that few could match. He had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, earned a Bronze Star for valor, and was being fast-tracked for promotion to gunnery sergeant. "Mind if I buy you a drink?" Marcus asked as he reached Sarah's table, flashing the confident smile that had worked countless times before. His tone carried the easy assurance of a man who rarely heard the word no. Sarah looked up from her tablet, taking in his appearance with a quick glance that revealed more than Marcus realized. She noted the ribbon rack on his chest, the quality of his uniform maintenance, and the way he carried himself. Military, definitely. Officer candidate or senior NCO, based on his bearing. The slight swagger suggested someone who had seen combat and come out successful. The way he had approached, direct, confident, assuming welcome, indicated someone accustomed to positive responses to his advances. "Thank you, but I'm fine with what I have," Sarah replied politely, gesturing to her club soda. Her voice was pleasant, but held a subtle note of dismissal that most people would recognize as a polite way to end the conversation. Marcus either didn't pick up on the subtle cue or chose to ignore it. He pulled out the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Come on, you can't spend your whole evening staring at spreadsheets. I'm Marcus, by the way. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps." He said the last part with the particular pride that Marines reserved for their branch affiliation. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but internally she was categorizing this encounter. The man wasn't threatening in a dangerous sense, but he was displaying the kind of aggressive confidence that could become problematic if not managed correctly. His decision to sit down without permission indicated someone who was used to taking what he wanted and having it work out in his favor. "Sarah," she replied simply, not offering a last name or any additional information. She closed her tablet and set it aside, giving him her attention in the hope that a brief, polite conversation would satisfy his need for interaction and send him on his way. "So what do you do, Sarah? Let me guess, government contractor? You've got that DC professional look down pat." Marcus leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone settling in for a longer conversation. "Something like that," Sarah answered vaguely. In her experience, most people lost interest quickly when faced with deliberately boring responses about office work. "And you're obviously military. What brings you to Murphy's tonight?" "Celebration. Just got word about my promotion track. Should be pinning on gunnery sergeant in the next few months." Marcus's chest swelled slightly with pride. Been working toward this for years. Combat deployments, leadership positions, the whole 9 yards. The Corps recognizes talent when it sees it. Sarah nodded politely. She had met hundreds of military personnel over the years, and she could usually identify the different types quickly. Marcus fell into the category she privately called the peacocks, genuinely competent and brave, but with egos that had grown to match their accomplishments. They weren't bad people, but they often had trouble accepting that their military achievements didn't automatically translate into civilian authority or attraction. "Congratulations," she said sincerely. "That's quite an accomplishment." "Thanks. You know, I've got to say, there's something different about you." Marcus leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was an intimate level. "Most of the women in here are either military wives looking for attention while their husbands are deployed, or defense contractor types who spend all day arguing about budget allocations. You're clearly smarter than that crowd." Sarah felt her professional alarm bells starting to ring. The comment wasn't just presumptuous, it was revealing. Marcus had just displayed a concerning attitude toward women in general and military families specifically. More problematic was his assumption that he could categorize and dismiss entire groups of people based on superficial observations. "I think you might be underestimating the people around us," Sarah replied carefully. "In my experience, you can never really know what someone is capable of just by looking at them." Marcus chuckled, mistaking her diplomatic response for flirtation. You're absolutely right. Take you, for example. Sitting here in your business casual outfit, looking like a mid-level manager, but I can tell there's more going on upstairs. He tapped his temple. I've got good instincts about people. Comes from leading Marines in combat situations where reading people wrong can get you killed. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of amusement and irritation. Marcus wasn't the first person to mistake her deliberately crafted ordinary appearance for actual ordinariness. The irony was that his good instincts were failing him spectacularly. He was sitting across from someone who had designed counterterrorism operations that had saved thousands of lives, someone who regularly briefed cabinet-level officials on threats he couldn't imagine, and someone who could probably recite more details about his own military record than he could remember. Combat experience certainly teaches you to pay attention to details, Sarah agreed. Though sometimes the most important details are the ones that aren't immediately obvious. Marcus interpreted this as encouragement. Exactly. You get it. Most people see the uniform and think they know everything about me. They don't understand what it takes to earn these. He gestured to his ribbon rack. Bronze Star Combat Action Ribbon, 3 deployment ribbons. Each one of these represents risks taken, lives saved, missions accomplished. Sarah looked at his ribbons with genuine respect. Whatever she thought of his personality, the man had clearly served with distinction. The Bronze Star, in particular, indicated real heroism under fire. But she also noticed what wasn't there. No joint service ribbons, no interagency cooperation awards, no indicators that he had worked outside the traditional military structure. Those are impressive achievements, Sarah said honestly. You've clearly served your country with distinction. That kind of service requires real courage. Marcus beamed at the recognition. Thank you. It's nice to meet someone who understands the significance. Too many civilians see military service as just another job. They don't get that some of us have been willing to put everything on the line for something bigger than ourselves. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus becoming increasingly animated as he shared stories from his deployments. Sarah listened politely, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated she understood military structure and terminology better than the average civilian. This only encouraged Marcus further, as he interpreted her knowledge as fascination with his experiences. What Marcus didn't realize was that Sarah was conducting her own form of interview. She was learning about his leadership style, his decision-making process, and his attitude toward authority and civilians. The picture that emerged was of a competent tactical leader who had thrived in hierarchical military environments, but who might struggle with the ambiguity and collaboration required in more complex operational settings. As the evening progressed, other patrons began to filter out of Murphy's. The afterwork crowd gave way to the serious drinkers, and the noise level dropped enough that conversations from nearby tables became audible. Sarah noticed that Marcus's voice had grown louder as he became more comfortable, and several of his stories included details that probably shouldn't be shared in a public setting. You know what? Marcus said, leaning back and studying Sarah with an appraising look. I've been doing all the talking. What about you? What's your story? And don't give me another vague answer about government contracting. A woman like you doesn't end up in D.C. by accident. Sarah considered her response carefully. She had learned to have several cover stories ready for different situations, each one boring enough to discourage further questioning while being detailed enough to sound authentic. The challenge was choosing the right level of mundane for someone who clearly enjoyed being the most interesting person in any conversation. I work in data analysis for a small consulting firm, Sarah replied. We help government agencies optimize their information processing workflows. It's about as exciting as it sounds. Lots of spreadsheets, efficiency reports, and budget reconciliation. The kind of work that keeps the bureaucracy running, but never makes headlines. Marcus nodded, but she could see him processing this information with the same analytical mind that had served him well in combat. Data analysis, huh? That actually makes sense. You've got that quiet confidence thing going on. Probably the type who sees patterns that other people miss. Sarah was mildly surprised by the accuracy of his observation. Despite his obvious ego and tendency to dominate conversations, Marcus did possess genuine insight into people. It was another reminder that underestimating people, even when they were underestimating you, was always a mistake. Pattern recognition is definitely part of the job, Sarah admitted. Though most of the patterns we deal with involve resource allocation and process efficiency. Not exactly the stuff of action movies. Still, I bet you're good at it. There's something about the way you listen, the way you ask questions. You're processing everything, aren't you? Figuring people out, understanding how they think. Marcus seemed pleased with his deduction. Sarah felt a slight chill despite the warmth of the crowded pub. Marcus's insight was getting uncomfortably close to the truth. His next question confirmed her growing concern about where this conversation was heading. So here's what I'm wondering, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. A smart woman like you, working in the D.C. area, probably making decent money. Why are you sitting alone in a place like Murphy's on a Tuesday night? Don't get me wrong, it's a decent bar, but it's not exactly the kind of upscale networking spot where someone in your position would typically hang out. The question revealed that Marcus had been observing her more carefully than she had initially realized. He had noticed details about her appearance and behavior that suggested a level of professional success that didn't match the casual setting. It was the kind of analytical thinking that made good soldiers, but it was also making Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. Sometimes you want to go somewhere where work doesn't follow you, Sarah replied, which was true enough. Places like this are good for thinking without interruption. Marcus nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answer. I get that. Sometimes you need to step away from the pressure, just be a regular person for a while. As he spoke, Sarah noticed that Marcus's phone had been buzzing periodically throughout their conversation. He had ignored it each time, keeping his attention focused on her, but the repeated interruptions suggested something requiring his attention. The professional part of her mind cataloged this as potentially significant. Military personnel at his level didn't typically ignore communications unless they were off-duty or dealing with something they considered more important. Sounds like someone's trying to reach you, Sarah observed, nodding toward his phone as it buzzed again. Marcus glanced down with irritation. Just the guys wondering where I disappeared to? They probably want to hit another bar, make a real celebration out of tonight. He looked back at Sarah with a hopeful expression. Actually, why don't you come along? I'd love to introduce you to my squad. They're good guys, and I think you'd enjoy meeting some real Marines. Sarah felt her internal warning systems activate fully. The suggestion that she accompany him to meet his friends crossed several lines that she carefully maintained in her personal security protocol. More concerning was his phrasing, real Marines, which suggested he was drawing distinctions between himself and others that might become problematic if challenged. That's very kind of you, but I should probably head home soon, Sarah replied diplomatically. Early morning tomorrow. Marcus's expression showed a flicker of disappointment that he quickly covered with renewed confidence. Come on, just one more drink. I promise my guys will be on their best behavior. Besides, I've been enjoying our conversation too much to let it end this early. The persistence was becoming uncomfortable, but Sarah recognized it as the behavior of someone who wasn't used to being turned down rather than anything more sinister. Still, her training demanded that she begin implementing exit strategies before the situation escalated further. I really do need to get going, Sarah said firmly, beginning to gather her things. But thank you for the conversation. It was nice meeting you, Marcus. As Sarah stood and reached for her tablet, Marcus also rose from his chair. His movement was smooth and controlled, the automatic response of someone whose body had been trained to react quickly to changing situations. The action itself wasn't threatening, but it reminded Sarah that she was dealing with someone who possessed significant physical capabilities and combat experience. Sarah, wait, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Look, I know I came on a little strong. It's just that you're clearly an interesting woman, and I don't meet many people around here who can keep up with a real conversation. How about we exchange numbers? Maybe grab dinner sometime when we both have more time. Sarah paused in her preparation to leave, recognizing that this moment would determine how the interaction concluded. She could provide a fake number to avoid immediate confrontation, but that would only delay potential problems. She could be directly honest about her lack of interest, but that might provoke the kind of reaction that would require her to reveal capabilities she preferred to keep hidden. Instead, she chose a middle path that had served her well in previous situations. Marcus, I'm flattered, but I'm not in a place where I can pursue new relationships right now. You seem like a good man, and I'm sure you'll find someone who can appreciate what you have to offer." The response was designed to let him maintain his dignity while clearly closing the door on further pursuit. Most people with reasonable social skills would recognize it as a polite but definitive rejection and respond accordingly. Marcus, however, seemed to interpret her words as a challenge to be overcome rather than a boundary to be respected. "Come on, Sarah. I can tell you're attracted to confidence, and I've got plenty of that. Whatever situation you think you're in, I bet a little excitement with a real man might be exactly what you need." The comment crossed a line that Sarah had hoped to avoid. The reference to a real man, combined with his dismissal of her clearly stated preferences, revealed an attitude that she found both personally offensive and professionally concerning. More problematically, his body language had shifted slightly. He had moved a half-step closer, and his posture had become more assertive in a way that suggested he was prepared to press his point. Sarah's training in threat assessment told her that Marcus wasn't dangerous in the sense of being a predator or someone who would use physical force to get his way. But he was displaying the kind of entitled persistence that could escalate quickly if not managed correctly. She needed to end this interaction decisively while avoiding any response that might provoke him into demonstrating just how real a man he considered himself to be. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice taking on a subtle but unmistakable tone of authority, "I've told you politely that I'm not interested. I need you to respect that, and let me leave." The change in her voice was slight but significant. The carefully maintained facade of pleasant, ordinary Sarah had slipped just enough to reveal the woman underneath, someone accustomed to being listened to, someone whose words carried weight, someone who was not afraid of confrontation when necessary. Marcus noticed the change immediately. His expression shifted as he processed this new information, and Sarah could see him reevaluating his assessment of her. The quiet office worker was still there, but now there was something else, something that suggested depths he hadn't previously recognized. For a moment, the two of them stood in a careful balance. Marcus was clearly debating whether to push forward or step back, while Sarah prepared for either possibility. The crowded pub continued its normal rhythm around them, other patrons unaware of the subtle tension playing out at the corner table. Then, Marcus's phone buzzed again, and the moment of decision arrived. Marcus glanced at his buzzing phone with growing irritation. The third call in 10 minutes from Corporal Williams meant either an emergency or the kind of drunk dial that Marines sometimes made when celebrating got out of hand. Either way, he was getting tired of the interruptions while he was trying to salvage what had become an unexpectedly challenging conversation with Sarah. "Sorry, let me just check this," Marcus said, answering the call without moving away from the table. "Williams, this better be important." Even in the noisy environment of Murphy's pub, Sarah could hear the agitated voice on the other end of the line. Years of intelligence training had taught her to pick up conversational details from partial audio, and what she was hearing raised immediate concerns. "Staff Sergeant, you need to get back to base right now," came the urgent voice through the phone. "There's been a development with the Jakarta situation. They're calling all senior NCOs for an immediate briefing." Marcus's entire demeanor changed instantly. The cocky pickup artist disappeared, replaced by the professional Marine who had earned his stripes through 3 combat deployments. "What kind of development, Williams? And keep it brief." "Can't say much over an open line, Staff Sergeant, but the XO said it's related to those intelligence reports from last week. They want all squad leaders in the briefing room in 45 minutes. Sarah felt her blood run cold. The Jakarta situation wasn't common knowledge. It was a developing crisis involving suspected terrorist financing networks that her department had been monitoring for the past 6 weeks. If Marcus's unit was being called in for immediate briefing, it meant the situation had escalated beyond the intelligence gathering phase and into active operational planning. More concerning was the casual way military personnel were discussing classified information over unsecured phone lines. Sarah's mind immediately began cataloging the security violations she was witnessing. Either Marcus's unit had terrible operational security protocols, or they weren't fully briefed on the sensitivity of what they were dealing with. Marcus ended the call and looked at Sarah with genuine regret. "I'm really sorry, but I have to go. Duty calls, you know how it is." He paused, then made one last attempt. Look, Sarah, I know tonight didn't go exactly as planned, but I'd really like to see you again. What do you say? Can I get your number? Sarah was facing a dilemma that her training had never fully prepared her for. She now knew that Marcus's Marine unit was about to be briefed on an operation that her department had been developing. Depending on their role in the mission, she might need to coordinate with them professionally. More immediately, she needed to assess whether the security breach she had just witnessed was an isolated incident or part of a larger problem that could compromise the entire operation. Marcus, Sarah said carefully, this Jakarta situation they're calling you in for. What can you tell me about your unit's involvement? Marcus looked at her with surprise. How do you know about Jakarta? I thought you said you worked in data analysis for a consulting firm. The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized she had made her own operational error. In her concern about security protocols, she had revealed knowledge she shouldn't possess according to her cover story. Now she faced a choice between maintaining her cover and potentially allowing security vulnerabilities to compromise an active operation. I work with government data, Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. Information about international situations sometimes crosses my desk in the form of economic impact analyses. Marcus studied her with new intensity. His combat experience had taught him to recognize when people weren't telling him the complete truth, and Sarah's explanation felt too convenient to be entirely accurate. Economic impact analyses, Marcus repeated slowly. Right. And these analyses just happen to use the same operational code names that we use in classified military briefings. Sarah realized that Marcus was smarter than she had given him credit for. His social skills might be lacking, but his analytical abilities were sharp enough to catch her mistake. She was now in the position of either blowing her cover completely or allowing him to walk into what might be a compromised operation. Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Sarah said, abandoning her casual tone entirely. The conversation you just had on your phone discussed classified information in a public setting. Depending on your unit's role in this operation, that could be a serious security breach. Marcus's expression shifted to one of confusion mixed with growing suspicion. Who exactly are you, Sarah? And how do you know enough about military operations to lecture me about security protocols? Before Sarah could answer, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, instead of a phone call, it was a text message. Marcus glanced at the screen, and his face went pale. What is it? Sarah asked, noting his reaction. Marcus looked up at her with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. The text is from my commanding officer. It says there's been a security alert related to tonight's briefing. All personnel are being rescreened before the meeting. He paused, studying Sarah with new eyes. Sarah, this is really strange timing. First you somehow know about Jakarta. Now there's suddenly a security alert right after I talked about it in public. Sarah felt the careful balance of her evening tilting toward complete exposure. Marcus wasn't just suspicious now. He was beginning to connect dots in a way that could lead him to conclusions she couldn't allow him to reach without proper clearance. Marcus, I need you to trust me for a moment, Sarah said, making a decision that would either resolve the situation or complicate it beyond repair. Before you go to that briefing, you need to call your commanding officer back and tell him you need to speak with someone from the Special Operations Analysis Division. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. The what division? Sarah, I've never heard of any Special Operations Analysis Division, and I've been working with interagency operations for 3 years. That's because your clearance level hasn't required you to know about it, Sarah replied calmly. But if your unit is being brought into the Jakarta operation, that's about to change. The implications of what Sarah was saying began to sink in for Marcus. He had spent his entire military career working within clearly defined hierarchies and procedures. The idea that there were entire divisions of the government that he had never heard of, despite his security clearance and operational experience, was both fascinating and unsettling. You're telling me, Marcus said slowly, that you work for some kind of secret government division that I don't have clearance to know about? I'm telling you that your unit may be about to receive operational orders that originated from my department, Sarah replied. And if that's the case, the security breach I just witnessed could compromise not just your mission, but the safety of personnel already deployed in support of this operation. Marcus sat back down heavily, his mind racing through the implications. This is insane. Are you telling me that the quiet woman I've been hitting on for the past hour is some kind of spy? Sarah almost smiled at the question. I'm telling you that the woman you've been hitting on is someone who takes operational security very seriously and who is now concerned that your unit might not be properly prepared for the level of sensitivity they're about to encounter. Prove it, Marcus said bluntly. If you're really who you're claiming to be, prove it. Sarah considered her options. Revealing her identity would require making phone calls that would alert multiple agencies to a potential security breach. It would also mean ending any possibility of maintaining her cover at Murphy's Pub, which had been a valuable operational resource. On the other hand, if Marcus's unit was indeed being brought into her operation without proper security protocols, the consequences could be far more serious than losing a safe meeting location. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a second phone, a secure device that looked identical to a standard smartphone, but contained encryption capabilities that would make NSA engineers proud. She dialed a number that Marcus couldn't see and waited for an answer. "This is Director Chun," Sarah said into the phone, using a voice that carried unmistakable authority. "I need to speak with Colonel Martinez immediately regarding a potential security issue with the Jakarta briefing scheduled for tonight." Marcus watched in stunned silence as Sarah conducted what was clearly an official conversation with someone in a position of significant authority. Her entire demeanor had changed. Gone was any trace of the pleasant, unremarkable woman he had approached earlier. In her place was someone who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. "Colonel Martinez, this is Sarah Chun from SOAD," Sarah continued, using the acronym for her division. "I'm currently with a Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez who received notification about tonight's Jakarta briefing. There may have been a security protocol breach that requires immediate attention." Sarah listened for a moment, then looked at Marcus. "What's your commanding officer's name and direct line?" "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, extension 4472. Marcus replied automatically, his training overriding his confusion. Sarah relayed the information in her phone, then ended the call. "Colonel Martinez is calling your CO right now. You should receive instructions within the next few minutes." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Who are you really, Sarah? And what kind of operation are we talking about here?" "I'm the person who designs the operations that people like you execute," Sarah replied honestly. "And Jakarta is the kind of operation where one security mistake can get a lot of people killed." As if on cue, Marcus's phone rang. He answered it immediately, recognizing his commanding officer's number. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez speaking, sir." Even from across the table, Sarah could hear the authoritative voice on the other end of the line. "Rodriguez, where are you right now?" "Murphy's Pub, sir. About 10 minutes from base." "Are you with a civilian named Sarah Chun?" Marcus looked at Sarah with amazement. "Yes, sir. I am." "Good. Ms. Chun has security credentials that I apparently wasn't briefed on. You are to accompany her to base immediately for a security review before tonight's briefing. Is that understood?" "Understood, sir. But, Colonel, what exactly, Rodriguez, you're about to get a crash course in operations that are way above your current clearance level. Ms. Chin will brief you on the way to base." "And Rodriguez?" "Yes, sir. Next time you decide to discuss operational details in a public bar, remember that you never know who might be listening." The call ended, and Marcus sat in stunned silence for a long moment. When he finally looked up at Sarah, his expression was a mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and grudging respect. "So," Marcus said finally, "I guess I should apologize for assuming you were just some office worker looking for excitement with a real man." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Apology accepted. Though I have to say, your pickup technique could use some work." Marcus laughed despite the surreal circumstances. "Yeah, I'm getting that impression. So what happens now?" "Now we go to your base, and I brief your unit on why operational security isn't just military protocol. It's the difference between mission success and getting your teammates killed," Sarah replied, standing and gathering her things. As they prepared to leave Murphy's Pub, Marcus looked at Sarah with new understanding. "You know, I spent this whole evening thinking I was the most dangerous person you'd ever meet. Turns out I was completely wrong about that, wasn't I?" Sarah considered the question as she shouldered her purse, which contained enough technological capability to coordinate military operations across 3 continents. Marcus, danger comes in many forms. The kind of danger you represent, physical courage, tactical skill, willingness to face enemy fire, that's obvious and immediate. The kind of danger I represent is the ability to make decisions that put people like you in harm's way for reasons they might never fully understand. Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the implications of what he had stumbled into. And you carry the responsibility every day? Every day, Sarah confirmed. Which is why I take security breaches seriously, even when they happen because a Marine is trying to impress what he thinks is a civilian consultant. As they walked toward the exit, Marcus reflected on how completely his evening had been turned upside down. He had approached Sarah thinking he was the worldly, experienced one who could offer her excitement and adventure. Instead, he was discovering that she inhabited a world of responsibility and consequence that made his combat experience look straightforward by comparison. "Sarah," Marcus said as they reached the parking lot, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. When I first sat down at your table tonight, did you already know who I was? Was this whole thing some kind of setup?" Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "Marcus, I had no idea who you were when you approached my table. I was genuinely trying to have a quiet drink while reviewing operational reports. You inserted yourself into my evening, not the other way around." Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and renewed embarrassment. "So your rejection of my advances had nothing to do with some secret government assessment of my character?" "My rejection of your advances had everything to do with the fact that you made assumptions about me, dismissed my clearly stated preferences, and demonstrated an attitude toward women that I found unappealing," Sarah replied bluntly. "The fact that you also committed multiple security violations just made it worse." As they walked toward Sarah's car, Marcus found himself seeing the entire evening from a completely different perspective. Every moment of confidence, every assumption he had made about Sarah's interest or availability, every casual reference to military operations, all of it took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his current understanding. "This is going to be a very interesting briefing," Marcus said as Sarah unlocked her car. "Yes, it is," Sarah agreed. "And Marcus? When we get to base, remember that your Marines are about to learn that the world is a lot more complex than they probably realize. How they handle that information could determine whether they're ready for what comes next." As they drove toward the Marine base, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many other ordinary-looking people he had encountered over the years who were actually extraordinary in ways he had never imagined. The thought was both humbling and slightly terrifying. Sarah, meanwhile, was already planning how to turn a potentially disastrous security breach into a teaching moment that would actually strengthen the operation's chances of success. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had made her one of the most effective directors in her department's history. Neither of them could have predicted when the evening began that a chance encounter in a crowded bar would lead to a conversation that would change both of their understanding of their roles in serving their country. But that was about to become the least surprising part of their story. The drive to Marine Corps Base Quantico took 23 minutes through the Virginia countryside, and Marcus spent most of that time trying to process the complete upheaval of everything he thought he understood about his career, his security clearance, and the woman sitting in the driver's seat beside him. Sarah drove with the same unremarkable competence she brought to everything else, not fast enough to attract attention, but efficient enough to get them where they needed to go quickly. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they passed through the base's outer security checkpoint. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" Sarah showed her credentials to the guard, who scanned them with equipment that Marcus had never seen before. Whatever information came up on the guard screen caused him to straighten noticeably and wave them through without the usual questions about their destination or purpose. 15 years in various capacities," Sarah replied as they drove toward the main administrative complex. "Started in intelligence analysis fresh out of graduate school. Moved into operational planning about 8 years ago. Took over the directorship 3 years ago when my predecessor was promoted to deputy assistant secretary level." Marcus tried to imagine what it would be like to spend 15 years making the kind of decisions that Sarah apparently made on a regular basis. His own career had been built around clear hierarchies, defined missions, and visible enemies. The world Sarah described sounded like it involved constant judgment calls about invisible threats and uncertain outcomes. "Do you ever miss having a normal job?" Marcus asked. Sarah considered the question as she parked in front of a building that Marcus recognized as housing senior command offices. "I'm not sure I remember what normal feels like anymore, but I can tell you that every morning when I read the threat assessments that cross my desk, I'm reminded why this work matters." As they walked toward the building entrance, Marcus noticed that Sarah moved through the military environment with the same invisible confidence she had displayed at Murphy's Pub. She clearly belonged here, even though she wore civilian clothes and carried herself differently than any military personnel he had ever encountered. The building's interior was a maze of corridors lined with offices displaying unit designations, operational charts, and the kind of motivational posters that seemed mandatory in military facilities. Sarah navigated the layout without hesitation, leading Marcus toward a conference room he had never seen before despite 3 years of assignments to various units based at Quantico. "Ms. Chun, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," called a voice from behind them. Marcus turned to see Lieutenant Colonel Thompson approaching with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed curiosity. "Thank you for coming in on short notice." Marcus had served under Thompson for 18 months and had never seen his commanding officer look uncertain about anything. Tonight, Thompson appeared to be dealing with a situation that exceeded his usual operational parameters. "Colonel Thompson," Sarah replied, extending her hand. "Thank you for accommodating this security review. I know it's an unusual request." "Ms. Chun, I've been in the Marines for 22 years, and I've never had a phone call like the one I received tonight," Thompson said honestly. "My superiors tell me that you have authority to brief my Marines on operational details that I apparently don't have clearance to discuss. I'm trying to understand how that's possible." Sarah's expression showed sympathy for Thompson's confusion. "Colonel, what you're experiencing is what happens when compartmentalized operations begin to overlap. Your Marines have skills that my department needs, but the operation itself involves intelligence sources and methods that require additional security protocols." Marcus watched this exchange with fascination. He was witnessing a conversation between two people who were clearly accustomed to being in charge of their respective domains, but who were now having to navigate authority structures that neither of them fully understood. "How many of my Marines will be affected by this briefing?" Thompson asked. "Initially, just Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's squad," Sarah replied. "Depending on how the operation develops, we may need to expand the briefing to additional personnel, but we want to start with the team that has the most relevant experience." Thompson nodded toward the conference room. "They're waiting inside. I should warn you, Ms. Chun, that some of them are pretty frustrated about being called back to base when they were expecting to celebrate Rodriguez's promotion." Sarah smiled slightly. "I understand their frustration, Colonel, but after tonight's briefing, I think they'll understand why their celebration had to be postponed." The conference room contained 8 Marines in various states of dress uniform and civilian clothes, representing Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's squad, plus 2 additional senior NCOs. Marcus recognized all of them immediately. These were the men and women he had served with through multiple deployments, people who had proven themselves in combat and earned his respect through shared hardship. Corporal Williams, the Marine who had made the phone calls, looked up as Marcus entered. "Staff Sergeant, what's going on?" "Nobody will tell us anything except that there's some kind of security issue." Marcus looked at Sarah, unsure of how to introduce her or explain their situation. Sarah stepped forward, taking control of the briefing with the natural authority of someone accustomed to addressing groups of confused military personnel. "Good evening, Marines. My name is Sarah Chun, and I'm the Director of Special Operations Analysis Division. I know you've never heard of my department, and there's a good reason for that. We operate under deep classification protocols that limit our visibility to personnel who have operational need to know." Sergeant Martinez raised her hand slightly. "Ma'am, what kind of operations are we talking about? And why are we hearing about this now?" Sarah appreciated the direct question. Marines, in her experience, preferred straightforward communication to diplomatic dancing around sensitive topics. "Sergeant Martinez, You're about to be briefed on an operation that involves neutralizing a terrorist financing network operating out of Jakarta, Indonesia. This network has been funneling money to organizations planning attacks against American interests throughout Southeast Asia. Marcus felt a chill as he realized that his casual conversation at Murphy's pub had involved details of an active counterterrorism operation. The full scope of his security breach was becoming clear, and it was worse than he had initially understood. The reason you're hearing about this now, Sarah continued, is that your unit has been selected to provide tactical support for an operation that requires both combat experience and the ability to operate in complex international environments. Unfortunately, there's been a security issue that we need to address before proceeding. The Marines exchanged glances that Marcus could read easily. They were wondering which one of them had made a mistake serious enough to require an emergency briefing from a department they had never heard of. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah said, looking directly at Marcus. Would you like to explain to your Marines what happened tonight? Marcus felt every eye in the room focus on him, and for the first time in his military career, he genuinely didn't know how to begin explaining his actions. The confidence that had served him throughout his deployments seemed inadequate for acknowledging that he had compromised operational security while trying to pick up a woman in a bar. Tonight, I was at Murphy's pub celebrating my promotion. Marcus began slowly. I received a phone call about this briefing, and I discussed operational details in a public setting without considering the security implications. Corporal Williams looked confused. Staff Sergeant, we all got the same phone call. What operational details? The Jakarta operation, Williams. I talked about classified information where civilian personnel could overhear it. Sergeant First Class Johnson, the squad's most experienced member, shook his head with obvious disappointment. Staff Sergeant, that's basic OPSEC. We learned better than that in boot camp. Marcus felt the weight of his Marines' disappointment, but Sarah intervened before the discussion could become a disciplinary hearing. Marines, the reason I'm conducting this briefing personally is that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's security breach created an opportunity for us to address some larger issues with this operation, Sarah said. The fact is, your unit was about to be briefed on Jakarta without adequate preparation for the kind of operational environment you'll be entering. Sarah moved to a wall-mounted screen and activated a presentation that displayed satellite imagery of Jakarta's financial district. Jakarta isn't like the combat environments you've operated in previously, Sarah explained. This isn't a battlefield where you can identify enemies by their uniforms or equipment. You'll be operating in an urban environment where the people you're tracking look like businessmen, where your targets conduct meetings in five-star hotels, and where a single mistake can trigger international incidents that affect American foreign policy for years. The imagery on the screen shifted to show surveillance photos of well-dressed individuals in corporate settings. Marcus noticed that several of his Marines were leaning forward, engaged by the complexity of what they were seeing. Your mission will be to provide security and tactical support for intelligence gathering operations targeting these individuals, Sarah continued. Some of them are legitimate businessmen who unknowingly facilitate terrorist financing through their companies. Others are active participants who use legitimate business as cover for moving money to terrorist organizations. Ma'am, Sergeant Martinez said, how are we supposed to tell the difference? That's an excellent question, Sergeant, and it's exactly why tonight's security breach actually created an opportunity, Sarah replied. You're going to need to understand not just the tactical elements of this operation, but the intelligence picture that drives every decision you'll make. Sarah clicked to a new slide showing organizational charts connecting individuals across multiple countries. Traditional military operations involve clearly defined objectives and straightforward rules of engagement, Sarah explained. This operation requires you to understand the relationships between targets, the legal frameworks governing your actions in different countries, and the potential consequences of every choice you make. Marcus was beginning to understand why his casual conversation at Murphy's pub had alarmed Sarah so much. The level of operational complexity she was describing required security protocols far beyond anything he had encountered in conventional military operations. Ma'am, what exactly will our role be? Asked Corporal Chun, the squad's communications specialist. Your team will be embedded with intelligence operatives who have been tracking this network for 8 months, Sarah replied. Your job will be to provide security, tactical expertise, and operational support while they gather evidence that can be used to shut down the financing pipeline. Are we talking about direct action missions? Johnson asked. Potentially, but only as a last resort, Sarah answered. The primary objective is intelligence gathering that can lead to coordinated law enforcement actions across multiple countries. Your tactical skills may be needed if targets attempt to resist arrest or if you encounter hostile surveillance, but the goal is to complete this operation without anyone realizing it happened. The Marines were quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what they were being asked to do. Marcus could see that they were intrigued by the complexity of the mission, but also concerned about operating in an environment where the rules of engagement were so different from their previous experience. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah said, addressing Marcus directly, your security breach tonight demonstrated exactly why this briefing was necessary. In conventional military operations, discussing mission details might compromise tactical surprise or operational timing. In intelligence operations like Jakarta, discussing mission details can compromise sources who have spent years building cover identities, expose methods that took decades to develop, and alert targets who will disappear before we can complete our investigation. Marcus nodded, finally, understanding the full scope of his mistake. Ma'am, what can I do to address the security breach? You've already done it by bringing it to my attention, Sarah replied. But now your entire squad needs to understand why the security protocols for this operation are different from anything you've encountered before. Sarah clicked to a new slide showing newspaper headlines from various international publications. Every person in this room has proven their courage in combat situations where the stakes were clear and immediate, Sarah said. Jakarta will test a different kind of courage. The discipline to follow protocols you don't fully understand, the judgment to make decisions based on incomplete information, and the patience to achieve objectives that may not be immediately visible. Ma'am, how do we prepare for something like that? Williams asked. You start by understanding that everything you think you know about operational security needs to be recalibrated, Sarah replied. In combat zones, you assume that everyone outside your unit is potentially hostile. In intelligence operations, you assume that everyone around you is potentially observing and analyzing your behavior. Sarah moved to the front of the room, making eye contact with each Marine as she spoke. Tonight, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez learned that the quiet woman he approached in a bar was actually someone with the authority to affect his entire unit's mission assignment, Sarah said. That's not unusual in the world we operate in. The person sitting next to you on the airplane, the waiter serving your dinner, the businessman making phone calls in the hotel lobby. Any of them could be intelligence operatives, either friendly or hostile. Marcus felt a chill as he realized how many assumptions he had made about Sarah based on her appearance and behavior. If she could maintain such effective cover while conducting operational business in a public setting, what did that say about his ability to recognize potential threats in an environment like Jakarta? Marines, Sarah concluded, your squad has been selected for this operation because you have demonstrated tactical excellence and the ability to adapt to changing situations. Jakarta will require both of those qualities, but it will also require you to develop new skills in an environment where mistakes have consequences that extend far beyond your immediate unit. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had been listening from the back of the room, stepped forward. Ms. Chun, what's our timeline for deployment? Colonel, that depends on how quickly your Marines can complete additional security training and demonstrate readiness for intelligence-supported operations, Sarah replied. We're looking at 4 to 6 weeks of preparation, followed by a deployment period of approximately 3 months. And this training will cover operational security protocols, cultural briefings, and coordination procedures with intelligence personnel. Among other things, yes. Your Marines will also receive training in surveillance detection, evidence handling, and legal frameworks for operating in international environments. Marcus looked around the room at his squad members, seeing a mixture of excitement and apprehension that matched his own feelings. The operation Sarah was describing represented a significant evolution from their previous deployments, but it also offered the kind of professional challenge that elite Marines were trained to embrace. "Ma'am," Marcus said, "what happens if we determine that our squad isn't ready for this type of operation?" Sarah smiled slightly, the first time all evening that her expression had shown anything other than professional seriousness. "Staff Sergeant, based on tonight's conversation, I'm confident that your squad has exactly the kind of analytical thinking and adaptability that this operation requires. The question isn't whether you're capable. It's whether you're willing to operate in an environment where success is measured differently than anything you've experienced before." As the briefing concluded and the Marines began to file out of the conference room, Marcus realized that his evening had fundamentally changed his understanding of his own role in serving his country. The cocky Marine who had approached Sarah's table at Murphy's pub seemed like a different person, someone whose confidence had been based on a limited understanding of the complexity of modern military operations. Sarah gathered her materials as the room emptied, but Marcus lingered, wanting to say something that would acknowledge the magnitude of what had transpired between them. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "I owe you an apology for more than just the security breach. I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong, and I behaved in a way that was disrespectful." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Marcus, your assumptions weren't unusual. Most people make judgments based on superficial observations. The difference is that your job now requires you to understand when those assumptions could get people killed. Will you be involved in our training for Jakarta?" "I'll be overseeing the program that prepares your squad for deployment," Sarah confirmed. "And Marcus, when we begin training next week, remember that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about ourselves. Your confidence has been an asset in combat situations, but it could be a liability in an environment where the enemy looks like everyone else." As Marcus left the conference room and walked toward the parking lot where his Marines were already discussing the implications of their new assignment, he reflected on how completely his understanding of his own capabilities had been challenged in the space of a few hours. The evening that had begun with him approaching what he thought was an ordinary woman in a bar had concluded with him being recruited for an operation that would test skills he didn't know he possessed. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn him to the Marines in the first place. The opportunity to discover what he was truly capable of when pushed beyond his comfort zone. 3 weeks into the specialized training program, Marcus was beginning to understand why Sarah had described Jakarta as requiring a different kind of courage. The physical demands of the program were manageable. His Marines were in excellent condition and adapted quickly to the urban combat scenarios they practiced daily. What challenged them was learning to think like intelligence operatives while maintaining their tactical effectiveness as a military unit. The training facility was located 40 minutes from Quantico at a site that officially didn't exist on any government maps. Sarah had explained on their first day that the facility was designed to simulate the kind of complex urban environment they would encounter in Jakarta, complete with hotel lobbies, financial district office buildings, and crowded marketplaces where operations had to be conducted without attracting public attention. "Rodriguez, your Marines are making good progress with tactical adaptations, but they're still thinking like Marines," said James Morrison, the lead instructor who had introduced himself simply as someone who had been conducting these types of operations for longer than any of them had been in military. "Jakarta isn't going to announce itself as a combat zone. You need to learn to recognize threats that look like ordinary business activities." Marcus was reviewing surveillance footage from a training exercise where his squad had successfully identified and tracked a simulated target through a mock financial district, but had missed 2 separate instances of hostile surveillance that could have compromised their entire operation. "What specifically did we miss?" Marcus asked, studying the footage for details his team had overlooked during the actual exercise. Morrison rewound the video to show a woman in business attire who had appeared at 3 separate locations during the exercise, always maintaining visual contact with Marcus's team while appearing to conduct routine business activities. "Watch her movement patterns," Morrison instructed. "She's not shopping, she's not waiting for meetings, and she's not conducting business. She's maintaining surveillance on your team while using commercial activity as cover for her positioning." Marcus felt frustrated as he recognized the sophisticated nature of the surveillance technique. In combat environments, enemy observers were usually identifiable by their positioning, equipment, or behavior. This woman had been virtually invisible because she looked exactly like every other professional in the crowded commercial district. How are we supposed to identify surveillance when it's conducted by people who look like civilians? Marcus asked. That's the whole point of this training, Staff Sergeant, Morrison replied. In Jakarta, everyone is a potential threat, but almost no one looks threatening. Your Marines need to develop new analytical skills that go beyond traditional threat recognition. Marcus's squad had been divided into smaller teams for specialized training in different aspects of intelligence-supported operations. Sergeant Martinez was becoming proficient in surveillance detection techniques, while Corporal Williams had shown unexpected aptitude for analyzing financial transactions that might indicate suspicious activity. Sergeant Johnson, with his extensive combat experience, was learning to coordinate with intelligence operatives whose methods differed significantly from military communication protocols. Staff Sergeant, can I speak with you privately? Asked a voice behind Marcus. He turned to see Sarah approaching, carrying a tablet that had become her constant companion during the training program. Of course, ma'am, Marcus replied, following Sarah to a quiet corner of the observation area. How are your Marines handling the psychological aspects of this training? Sarah asked. Morrison's reports indicate excellent tactical adaptation, but I want to hear your assessment of their readiness for the operational environment. Marcus considered the question carefully. His Marines were clearly capable of mastering the technical skills required for intelligence operations, but he had observed subtle changes in their behavior that concerned him. They're struggling with the ambiguity, Marcus admitted. In combat situations, we know who we're fighting and why we're fighting them. This training requires them to operate in an environment where they can't be certain about anyone's motivations or loyalties. Sarah nodded, showing that his observations matched her own assessments. That uncertainty is exactly what makes intelligence operations so challenging for military personnel. Your Marines have been trained to make quick, decisive judgments based on incomplete information. Intelligence work requires them to live with uncertainty for extended periods while continuing to function effectively. Is that something that can be trained, or is it a fundamental personality difference? Marcus asked. It can definitely be trained, but it requires a different approach than traditional military instruction, Sarah replied. Your Marines need to learn to compartmentalize their decision-making processes, maintaining tactical readiness while accepting that they may not understand the larger strategic picture. Marcus had been thinking about this challenge throughout the training program. His own leadership style had always emphasized clear communication about mission objectives and transparent explanations of strategic goals. Intelligence operations seemed to require a completely different approach to unit cohesion and motivation. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? Marcus said, then paused as he realized the presumption of his question. Go ahead. How do you handle the psychological pressure of making decisions that affect people's lives when you can't share the reasoning behind those decisions with the people who have to execute them? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her considering how to answer a question that touched on fundamental aspects of her professional identity. Marcus, the hardest part of my job isn't making difficult decisions under pressure, Sarah said finally. It's living with the knowledge that the people who trust me to make those decisions can never fully understand the factors that influence them. Your Marines trust you because they understand your reasoning and share your objectives. Intelligence personnel have to trust each other based on professional competence and demonstrated reliability, even when they disagree with decisions they're asked to implement. Marcus was beginning to understand why Sarah had seemed so controlled during their first encounter at Murphy's Pub. The emotional discipline required for her work was fundamentally different from anything he had previously encountered. How do you maintain unit cohesion when your team members can't share information with each other? Marcus asked. You focus on shared professional values rather than shared information, Sarah replied. Your Marines need to learn that operational success in intelligence environments depends on everyone doing their job excellently, even when they can't see how their individual contributions fit into the larger mission. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison approaching with a concerned expression. Director Chun, we may have a problem with the Jakarta timeline, Morrison said. Intelligence reports from the field indicate that our targets are accelerating their activities. We may need to deploy earlier than planned. Sarah's demeanor shifted immediately to the focused intensity Marcus had observed during their first briefing. How much earlier? 2 weeks, possibly less. The financing network has apparently identified some vulnerabilities in their current procedures, and they're moving to implement new security protocols. If we wait for the full training cycle, we may lose our operational window. Sarah looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal concern. Staff Sergeant, I need your honest evaluation. Are your Marines ready for deployment? Or do we need to consider alternative tactical support? Marcus felt the weight of the question. His squad had made significant progress during their training, but they were still adapting to the complex decision-making requirements of intelligence operations. Deploying them prematurely could compromise the mission or put them in situations they weren't fully prepared to handle. Give me 24 hours to conduct readiness assessments with each team member, Marcus replied. I'll have a definitive answer for you tomorrow. We may not have 24 hours, Morrison interjected. The latest intelligence suggests that our targets are planning to relocate their primary operations within the next 10 days. If we lose track of them now, it could take months to re-establish contact. Sarah considered the options with the kind of rapid analytical thinking that Marcus was learning to recognize as characteristic of intelligence professionals. She was obviously processing multiple variables simultaneously: operational timelines, personnel readiness, strategic consequences, and political implications. Marcus, I need you to understand something, Sarah said. Intelligence operations don't wait for perfect readiness. They require judgment about acceptable risk levels based on available resources and operational necessities. Your Marines don't need to be perfect at intelligence work. They need to be good enough to support professionals who are expert at intelligence work. Marcus realized that Sarah was offering him a different framework for evaluating his squad's readiness. Instead of asking whether his Marines could function independently as intelligence operatives, she was asking whether they could effectively support intelligence operatives while maintaining their own tactical capabilities. In that case, I think we're ready, Marcus said after a moment of consideration. My Marines understand their limitations, but they're adaptable enough to follow guidance from intelligence professionals while contributing their own expertise. Are you certain? Sarah pressed. Once we deploy, there won't be opportunities for additional training or personnel substitutions. Your Marines will need to perform effectively from the moment they arrive in Jakarta. Marcus thought about his squad members, their individual strengths, their adaptation to the training program, and their demonstrated ability to function under pressure. Williams had developed impressive skills in financial analysis despite having no previous experience with corporate investigations. Martinez had proven capable of conducting surveillance in complex urban environments while maintaining her tactical awareness. Johnson's extensive combat experience had translated well to coordinating with intelligence personnel who operated under different protocols than military units. I'm certain, Marcus confirmed, but I want to brief them personally about the accelerated timeline and give each of them the opportunity to request reassignment if they have concerns about their readiness. Sarah smiled slightly. The first time Marcus had seen her show approval for one of his decisions since they had begun working together. That's exactly the kind of leadership thinking that Jakarta will require, Sarah said. You'll be operating in an environment where your Marines need to trust your judgment even when they can't understand all the factors that influence your decisions. Morrison looked relieved that the deployment question had been resolved. Director Chun, should I begin finalizing logistics for departure next week? Yes, but coordinate with Colonel Thompson to ensure that Rodriguez's unit completes all required pre-deployment procedures, Sarah replied. And Morrison? I want daily readiness briefings from now until departure. As Morrison left to begin deployment preparations, Sarah turned her attention back to Marcus. Marcus, there's something else we need to discuss, Sarah said. Once you deploy to Jakarta, our professional relationship is going to change significantly. I'll be coordinating your mission from Washington, but you'll be reporting to field operatives who have different priorities and different methods than anything you've experienced. Marcus sensed that Sarah was preparing him for operational realities that the training program couldn't fully simulate. What should I expect? Marcus asked. You should expect to receive orders that seem to contradict your tactical training, to be asked to take risks that appear unnecessary, and To witness activities that may not make sense from a military perspective, Sarah replied. Your job will be to follow those orders while keeping your Marines safe and mission-focused. And if I disagree with the field operative's decisions, then you'll need to express your concerns through proper channels while continuing to execute your assigned role, Sarah said. Intelligence operations require a different kind of military discipline than combat operations. You'll be supporting objectives that may not be immediately apparent, using methods that may seem inefficient to achieve results that may not be visible until long after your deployment ends. Marcus was beginning to understand the full complexity of what he and his Marines were being asked to do. They weren't just adapting their tactical skills to a new environment. They were learning to function within a completely different professional culture with different definitions of success, different approaches to risk management, and different standards for evaluating operational effectiveness. Sarah, can I ask you one more question before I brief my Marines about the deployment? Marcus said, Of course. During our first conversation at Murphy's Pub, you said that danger comes in many forms. I understand now what you meant about the difference between physical danger and the kind of responsibility you carry. But what kind of danger am I putting my Marines in by accepting this mission? Sarah considered the question with obvious seriousness before answering. Marcus, the danger in Jakarta isn't primarily physical, although that risk exists, Sarah said. The danger is professional and psychological. Your Marines will be exposed to information that could change their understanding of how international relations actually work. They'll witness activities that may challenge their assumptions about American foreign policy, and they'll be asked to keep secrets that could affect their relationships with family and friends for the rest of their careers. Are you saying we might learn things that we wish we didn't know? I'm saying that intelligence work reveals complexities that aren't visible from traditional military perspectives, Sarah replied. Your Marines will see how decisions are actually made at levels of government they've never interacted with, and they'll understand the kinds of compromises that are necessary to protect American interests in an imperfect world. Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing that Sarah was preparing him for the possibility that his Marines might struggle with the ethical ambiguities of intelligence work. Will they have support for dealing with those psychological challenges? Yes, but it will be different from military support systems, Sarah said. Intelligence personnel develop coping mechanisms based on professional compartmentalization and long-term perspective. Your Marines will need to learn those techniques while maintaining their own military identity and values. As Marcus prepared to return to his squad for their final training exercises, he reflected on how much his understanding of military service had evolved since his encounter with Sarah at Murphy's Pub. The confident Marine who had approached her table that night had been operating with a relatively simple view of duty, honor, and service. The person he was becoming understood that serving his country effectively might require him to embrace complexities that challenge some of his fundamental assumptions about right and wrong. Marcus, Sarah called as he reached the door. Your Marines are fortunate to have a leader who asks the right questions. That quality will serve them well in Jakarta. As Marcus rejoined his squad for their final preparation, he realized that the upcoming deployment would test not just their tactical abilities, but their capacity to grow beyond the confident certainties that had defined their previous military service. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of challenge that would determine whether they were truly ready for the responsibilities that came with protecting their country in an increasingly complex world. 6 months after his encounter with Sarah at Murphy's Pub, Marcus stood in the same location where their unexpected meeting had begun, but everything about his perspective had fundamentally changed. The Jakarta operation had concluded 3 weeks earlier, and tonight marked the first time he had returned to the bar that had inadvertently launched the most challenging and transformative period of his military career. The mission itself had lasted 12 weeks, during which Marcus and his Marines had operated in an environment that bore no resemblance to their previous deployments. Instead of clearly defined combat zones with identifiable enemies, they had worked in Jakarta's gleaming financial district, providing security and tactical support for intelligence operatives who tracked money flows through legitimate businesses that served as fronts for terrorist financing networks. Marcus ordered a beer and sat at the same corner table where Sarah had been reviewing what he now understood were operational briefings disguised as quarterly reports. The irony wasn't lost on him. that he was now capable of recognizing the subtle indicators he had completely missed during their first encounter. The way she had maintained situational awareness while appearing focused on her tablet, her careful positioning that allowed clear sight lines to all entrances, and her selection of a table that provided both privacy and quick exit routes. The Jakarta operation had succeeded beyond the intelligence community's most optimistic projections. The financing network had been dismantled through coordinated arrests across 4 countries, based on evidence gathered during surveillance operations that Marcus's squad had helped protect and facilitate. More than 24 individuals have been arrested, and financial institutions in 6 countries had implemented new protocols designed to prevent similar networks from operating undetected. But success in intelligence operations, Marcus had learned, was measured differently than success in conventional military missions. There had been no dramatic firefights, no moments of obvious heroism, and no clear point at which they could declare victory over an identified enemy. Instead, there had been weeks of patient surveillance, careful evidence collection, and the constant tension of operating in an environment where a single mistake could compromise months of preparation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, came a familiar voice from behind him. Marcus turned to see Sarah approaching, carrying the same type of tablet she had used during their first meeting and wearing the same kind of unremarkable business attire that had initially caused him to underestimate her so completely. "Sarah," Marcus said, standing and offering her the chair across from him. "What brings you to Murphy's tonight?" "Coincidence, actually," Sarah replied, settling into her seat. "I'm meeting a colleague to discuss our next operation, and this location still provides the operational security I need for sensitive conversations." Marcus smiled at the casual way she described conducting classified business in a crowded bar. 3 months ago, that would have seemed impossibly reckless to him. Now he understood that hiding sensitive activities in plain sight was one of the fundamental skills that made Sarah effective at her job. "How are your Marines adjusting to being back?" Sarah asked. "Better than I expected, actually," Marcus replied honestly. "The hardest part seems to be readjusting to the simplicity of conventional military operations after dealing with the complexity of intelligence work." During the Jakarta deployment, Marcus had watched his Marines develop skills and perspectives that went far beyond their original tactical training. Sergeant Martinez had become proficient at analyzing financial records for suspicious patterns, work that required patience and attention to detail that complemented her natural tactical abilities. Corporal Williams had learned to coordinate with local law enforcement agencies whose procedures and priorities differed significantly from American military protocols. Sergeant Johnson had developed an intuitive understanding of urban surveillance techniques that made him valuable for protecting intelligence operatives in complex operational environments. "Are any of them interested in transitioning to intelligence work permanently?" Sarah asked. Marcus had been expecting this question. During their final debriefing in Jakarta, 2 of his Marines had explicitly asked about opportunities to work with intelligence agencies after completing their military service. The experience had opened their eyes to career possibilities they had never previously considered. Martinez and Williams have both expressed interest in continuing this type of work, Marcus replied. "They're planning to apply for positions with different agencies after their current enlistments end." Sarah nodded, making a mental note that Marcus recognized as her standard practice for tracking potential recruitment opportunities. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "How has the experience affected your own career plans?" Marcus had been wrestling with this question since returning from Jakarta. The operation had challenged every assumption he had made about military service, leadership, and his own capabilities. More importantly, it had exposed him to aspects of national security that weren't visible from traditional military perspectives. "I've been thinking about that a lot," Marcus admitted. "Jakarta showed me that there are ways to serve my country that I never knew existed. But I'm not sure I'm suited for the kind of long-term